This is the story of Paul Atreides, a boy born into privilege, shaped by duty, and forged in the crucible of a desert world. From his first breath, his life was never truly his own. Destiny loomed over him like a storm on the horizon. Heir to House Atreides, the Kwisatz Haderach, the breaker of empires. Paul didn't choose greatness, it chose him. And greatness is a cruel master. It demands everything and takes even more. This is a tale of prophecy and power, of betrayal and sacrifice. Paul's rise shook the galaxy to its core. His choices carried the weight of 1,000 worlds. His triumphs came at a price no one could imagine. Yet his name echoes across time, whispered as both savior and destroyer. We'll follow his journey from the safe, lush halls of Caladan to the unforgiving sands of Arrakis. We'll see how a young man became a legend, and how that legend became a cautionary tale. Along the way, we'll explore the forces that shaped him, his family, his enemies, and the unrelenting hand of fate. This isn't a hero's tale. It's the beginning of a journey. From Paul's first days on Caladan, the seeds of his destiny were already taking root. Real quick, if you're enjoying the video, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons. Now let's get back to the video. Paul Atreides was born on Caladan, a planet of rolling seas and gray skies. Its waves shaped his early days, a world far removed from the harshness of Arrakis. Paul grew up surrounded by honor and whispers of danger. His father, Duke Leto Atreides, ruled with strength and fairness, a man respected by allies and feared by enemies. His mother, Lady Jessica, was mysterious, sharp, and trained in the secret ways of the Bene Gesserit. Paul wasn't like other children. He was quiet, but his eyes saw everything. Even as a boy, he had a mind that worked faster, a focus that cut deeper. He wasn't raised just as a son. He was prepared as something far more. Duncan Idaho taught him how to fight. The swordmaster of House Atreides was loyal to the core, a warrior who carried the weight of the family's honor on his blade. Paul learned precision and discipline, how to strike fast and think faster. Gurney Halleck gave him balance. The battle-hardened troubadour taught him not just how to wield a blade, but how to carry conviction into every strike. Gurney's lessons extended beyond combat. He believed that fighting wasn't just about survival, it was about honor, loyalty, and purpose. As he once said, "Mood's a thing for cattle or making love or playing the balisette. It's not for fighting." While Gurney trained Paul in the art of war, he also reminded him that a warrior must have a reason to fight, something greater than the battle itself. Whether it was through a sparring session or the mournful chords of his balisette, Gurney tempered brutality with humanity, shaping Paul into a warrior who could wield both strength and restraint. Thufir Hawat sharpened Paul's mind. The Mentat, a human computer, taught him the art of strategy, how to calculate probabilities, predict outcomes, and anticipate moves before an enemy could make them. And from Lady Jessica, Paul learned control. She taught him the Bene Gesserit's secret arts, how to command with his voice, how to see through deception, how to use his mind as a weapon. These were lessons no Bene Gesserit was meant to teach a man, but Jessica had already defied her order by bearing a son instead of the daughter they demanded. She wasn't about to stop there. By the time Paul was a teenager, he was no ordinary heir. He was a weapon in the making, a boy shaped by loyalty, wisdom, and the cold logic of survival. But even with all his training, he couldn't see what awaited him on the sands of Arrakis. The Atreides left Caladan behind. They traded the safety of its seas for the harshness of Arrakis, a desert world that burned under two suns. To others, Arrakis was a wasteland. To the Atreides, it was an opportunity and a trap. The Emperor had handed them the planet, but it was no gift. It was a test of their strength and a prelude to betrayal. Arrakis was more than sand and wind. It was spice, the melange, the substance that ruled the galaxy. With spice came power, and with power came enemies. The Harkonnens, cruel and fat with greed, had held the planet for years. Now they waited in the shadows, ready to strike. Paul's life changed the moment he set foot on Arrakis. The heat was relentless, the dunes stretched forever, yet he wasn't afraid. He had been prepared for challenges, but nothing could prepare him for the Fremen. They were the soul of Arrakis, hidden among the sands, as wild and untamed as the planet itself. They watched the newcomers with silent eyes, judging, waiting. The Atreides worked quickly. Duke Leto brought justice and order where there had been chaos. He treated the Fremen with respect. He studied the spice, the desert, and the creatures that roam beneath the sands. The great sandworms, ancient and deadly. It was a fragile balance, but it was working. Then the betrayal came. The Harkonnens didn't strike alone. The Emperor sent his Sardaukar, killers dressed as soldiers, ruthless as the desert itself. They came in the night with poison in their veins and death in their hands. The House Atreides crumbled under the weight of treachery. Leto fell. His final act was to use his death as a weapon, a last defiant blow against Baron Harkonnen. Paul and Jessica fled into the sands. They left everything behind, the keep, the banners, the name. They became hunted, shadows in the desert with nothing but each other. It was here among the dunes that Paul began to change. He started to dream, not the vague dreams of a boy, but sharp, terrifying visions of 1,000 possible futures. He saw paths branching out like cracks in glass. He saw himself standing at the center, the weight of a galaxy pressing down on his shoulders. The spice amplified his mind, but it didn't bring clarity. It brought chaos. The Fremen found them, or perhaps Paul found the Fremen. In their leader, Stilgar, he saw strength. In their way of life, he saw survival. And in their reverence, he saw something dangerous, hope. They called him the Mahdi, a savior, a legend come to life. Paul was no longer a boy. Arrakis had stripped that away, burned it under its sun, and buried it in its sands. What rose from the desert was something new, something the galaxy had never seen before. The desert changes a man. It strips away weakness, burns away doubt. Paul Atreides entered the sands as a boy fleeing death. He emerged as something else. Among the Fremen, Paul found not just refuge, but purpose. They lived by the desert's rules, harsh, unyielding, and honest. They carried knives made from the teeth of sandworms, and their eyes glowed blue from spice. They didn't just survive Arrakis, they thrived. In their strength, Paul saw the seeds of an army. In their faith, he saw a power greater than any banner or throne. But first he had to prove himself. The Fremen did not follow lightly. Respect was earned in blood and sweat, and Paul spilled both. He mastered the Kreisknife, the weapon of the desert. He learned the rhythm of the sands, the steps needed to summon and ride a worm, a feat that turned a man into a legend. They gave him a name, Muad'Dib. It was the name of a desert mouse, a creature small but fierce, able to survive the harshest conditions. The name was more than a title. It was a bond tying Paul to the Fremen and the desert itself. Paul wasn't just becoming a Fremen. He was becoming something more. The spice flowed through him, unlocking doors in his mind he hadn't known existed. His visions became sharper, more vivid. He saw the jihad, a storm of blood and fire sweeping across the galaxy, carried on the backs of Fremen warriors shouting his name. He saw empires falling, entire worlds burning in his name. It terrified him. It empowered him. The Fremen began to rally around him. They weren't just following Muad'Dib. They were following a prophecy. To them, he was the Mahdi, the one who would lead them to freedom. Paul didn't ask for their devotion, but he couldn't stop it. He needed them as much as they needed him. Under his leadership, the Fremen turned their guerrilla raids into a full-scale rebellion. Spice shipments were disrupted. Harkonnen forces were annihilated. Every skirmish brought Paul closer to his goal, control of Arrakis, control of the spice, control of the galaxy. But the power he wielded came with a price. Each vision of the future weighed heavier on his soul. He saw paths where he triumphed, but lost himself, paths where he refused the call and doomed the galaxy. The future was a labyrinth, and every step he took seemed to lead him deeper into its traps. Muad'Dib was born, but his transformation was only beginning. The desert had shaped him, but the galaxy awaited its Kwisatz Haderach. Paul's transformation was far from complete. In the deep desert among the Fremen, his visions began to crystallize. The spice had unlocked a door in his mind, and with each passing day, he stepped further through it. He was no longer just a man, he was becoming the Kwisatz Haderach. The Kwisatz Haderach was more than a title. It was a myth, a prophecy whispered by the Bene Gesserit for generations. A man who could see both past and future, who could exist in the spaces their sisterhood could not. The culmination of centuries of genetic breeding, manipulation, and control. But Paul was not the Kwisatz Haderach they had planned. He was an accident of defiance, the unexpected son of a woman who dared to disobey. Paul's prescience grew sharper, deeper. He didn't just see futures, he felt them. Each possibility, each path was like a thread pulling at his mind. Some led to triumph, others to destruction. But one vision haunted him above all, the jihad. A holy war waged in his name, spreading like wildfire across the galaxy. Billions dead. Empires reduced to rubble. All of it carried on the cries of, Muad'Dib! It wasn't glory he saw, it was horror. Yet he couldn't stop. The weight of destiny was too great. His every action seemed to bring him closer to the path he dreaded, and the galaxy's chaos demanded his rise. The Fremen needed a leader, the oppressed needed a savior, and Paul needed the power to protect what little he had left. His visions pushed him toward a dangerous ritual, the water of life, a poison that no man had ever survived. It was the ultimate test. The Bene Gesserit feared it, even as they revered it. For Paul, it was not a choice, but an inevitability. He drank, and the poison burned through him, tearing apart his mind and body. Yet he did not die. Instead, he saw everything. In that moment, Paul truly became the Kwisatz Haderach. He didn't just see the future, he became it. Past, present, and future folded into one, a tapestry of endless possibilities. His mind stretched across time, across space, touching every thread of existence. It was power beyond comprehension, and it terrified him. Paul emerged from the ritual changed. The Fremen saw it as proof of his divinity. To them, he was the Mahdi, their prophesied savior. To Paul, it was a curse. The jihad loomed ever closer, and he could feel its fire licking at the edges of the galaxy. He was no longer a man fighting for survival. He was a force of nature, a storm that could not be stopped. With this newfound power, Paul turned his attention to Arrakis. The planet was not just a battleground. It was the key to the galaxy. Whoever controlled the spice controlled everything. And Paul was ready to take it all. Arrakis was a furnace. Its sands burned under the relentless heat of twin suns, its skies cruel and empty. To Paul, it was not just a world, it was the key. Whoever controlled Arrakis controlled the spice, and whoever controlled the spice controlled the galaxy. This planet would be his battleground. If he could take Arrakis, he could take the galaxy. The war began in silence. Fremen warriors moved like ghosts through the desert, their knowledge of the terrain unmatched. They struck Harkonnen's spice operations with precision, sabotaging supply lines and dismantling infrastructure. Each victory was a cut to the Harkonnen Empire, bleeding it dry. As Halleck had once warned, the Fremen were dangerous. These were people who lived on the knife edge, who could live for weeks in the open desert, who could think and fight as though born to it. Their cunning and mastery of desert power turned Arrakis into an unconquerable battlefield for outsiders. The desert, the spice, and even the great worms themselves obeyed the Fremen. Under Paul's leadership, the desert had risen against the Harkonnens. The Harkonnen forces faltered under the weight of Paul's relentless campaign. Their ranks, accustomed to dominance through wealth and fear, crumbled before the ferocity of the Fremen. Every battle left them more scattered, their morale shattered. Baron Harkonnen, far from the chaos, observed from his fortress on Gidi Prime. He seethed with frustration, knowing his empire was slipping from his grasp. Yet his arrogance remained intact, bolstered by his alliance with the Emperor. The Baron believed his schemes could still secure victory, but the sands of Arrakis had turned against him. His downfall was inevitable, but it would not come on the battlefield. That moment belonged to someone else. Paul's gaze shifted toward the Emperor himself. Shaddam IV sat on his throne far from the sands, relying on the elite Sardaukar to maintain his rule. These warriors, trained to kill without mercy, were thought to be invincible, but even they were no match for the Fremen. Paul had already seen the truth of this in action. "You heard my father speak of desert power," Paul said. "There it is. The surface of this planet is ours. No storm, nor creature, nor condition can stop us." With their mastery of the sands and their ability to summon the worms as allies, the Fremen turned the desert into their ultimate weapon. In the end, it was not the Sardaukar's ruthlessness, but their ignorance of the desert that sealed their fate. The final blow was not delivered on the battlefield, but through strategy. Paul's voice carried across the galaxy in a simple, undeniable ultimatum. If the Emperor did not come to Arrakis, the spice would stop flowing. No spice, no trade, no empire. This truth, sharp as a crysknife, left Shaddam IV with no choice. He came to Arrakis not as a ruler commanding respect, but as a man forced to confront a rising power he could no longer ignore. As the Emperor arrived on Arrakis, bringing his Sardaukar and trusted allies, he entered a storm he couldn't control. The Fremen's domination of the desert was absolute. Paul's command of the spice was no less powerful. "The guild itself caused this by spreading tales about what we do here," Paul had explained. "The surface of this planet is ours." This control over the desert and its resources, the worms, the spice, and the storm itself, forced the Emperor to bend. It was a truth as sharp as a crysknife. On Arrakis, Paul Atreides was more than a leader. He was the master of a world no one could claim but him. Paul's confrontation with the Emperor marked the turning point. Standing before the most powerful man in the galaxy, Paul demanded surrender. The Emperor would abdicate, surrendering the throne to House Atreides. To seal his rule, Paul would marry Princess Irulan. Not for love, but for strategy, binding the Corrino dynasty to his ascension. The jihad began, carried forward by armies marching under Paul's banner. They swept across the stars like an uncontrollable storm. Cities burned, worlds fell, millions died. Paul didn't need his prescient visions to see the horror. It unfolded before his eyes. The galaxy cried out his name, but their cries were of fear as much as reverence. Paul had taken the galaxy, but it came at an unimaginable cost. He sat atop a throne built on conquest and bloodshed, weighed down by the demands of an empire. His triumph was absolute, but so too was his isolation. Power had exacted its toll, and the echoes of his jihad promised that the galaxy's suffering had only just begun. Paul sat on the throne, but it felt more like a cage. The galaxy was his, yet it slipped through his fingers like sand. The Fremen called him a savior, others called him a tyrant, he called himself trapped. The jihad was everywhere. Armies roared his name as they swept across the stars. They conquered in his honor, killed in his name. Paul didn't lead them. He couldn't stop them. The future he had seen, the one he feared, had come alive. It wasn't a victory march. It was a storm, endless and brutal. The Fremen who once revered him grew restless. They had fought for freedom and found themselves shackled to his empire. The desert warriors wanted a leader, not a god. But Paul was both, and they couldn't separate the man from the myth. Paul tried to stop the bloodshed. He spoke to his council. He issued decrees, but the machine of the jihad was too big, too wild. Every step he took to control it only fed the flames. He saw the galaxy burning in his visions, and now it burned before his eyes. He lost Chani, the woman he truly loved. She gave him sons, but the cost was her life. Irulan, the political wife, could give him nothing but alliances. Her cold smile was a reminder of the sacrifices he had made. Every day on the throne was another day away from the life he wanted, the life that was gone. Paul walked the line between ruler and prophet, man and myth. The Bene Gesserit feared him. The nobles plotted against him, the Fremen questioned him, and the galaxy worshipped him. He saw too much. His prescience was both gift and curse. The future was a labyrinth, and he wandered it endlessly. Every choice was a trap. Every vision showed more death, more suffering. Paul didn't rule the galaxy ruled him. In the end, the power he had fought for felt hollow. The jihad grew stronger, and Paul grew weaker. He wanted to escape, to leave the throne, the visions, the galaxy, but there was no escape, not for Muad'Dib. He wasn't just a man anymore, he was a symbol, and symbols don't get to rest. Paul lost his sight, but he saw more than ever. The explosion, a stoneburner's cruel light, took his eyes. The galaxy thought it had crippled him. It hadn't. Paul no longer needed vision. The spice had unlocked his mind, and prescience guided his every step. The universe unfolded before him, brighter and sharper than any mortal eyes could see. The Fremen called him a miracle. To walk blind through the world, to see what others could not, was proof to them that Paul was their Mahdi. But Paul felt no pride in their praise. He felt their weight, their expectations. Every prayer whispered to Muad'Dib was another chain around his neck. The jihad raged on, and Paul felt it as a wound that wouldn't heal. His name had become a war cry, shouted by armies as they slaughtered in his honor. The blood spilled in his name burned in his visions, staining every possible future. He was both emperor and prisoner, chained to a destiny he could no longer escape. Paul began to see the cracks in the empire he had built. The Fremen, once united under his banner, were restless. The desert people had dreamed of freedom, but they found themselves bound by the empire's rule. Even Stilgar, his closest ally, questioned Paul's choices. The dream of Muad'Dib had become a nightmare. In the depths of his despair, Paul realized the truth. He could no longer lead. The galaxy didn't need him. It needed the myth of him. And so, he made his decision. The desert had taken everything from him, his father, his love, his sight. Now it would take him too. Paul walked into the sands following the old Fremen custom. A blind man's fate was to leave, to surrender to Shai-Hulud, the great sandworm, and become one with the desert. But Paul's walk was not just an end, it was a beginning. He left behind the throne, the jihad, the galaxy. He left behind the name Muad'Dib. In the eyes of the empire, Paul Atreides was gone. But in the depths of the desert, he found something else. Peace, perhaps, or simply silence. Paul Atreides, the blind emperor, had disappeared into legend. The man was gone, but the myth remained. And myths, like the desert, never truly die. Paul Atreides disappeared, but his shadow stretched across the galaxy. His name echoed in the prayers of the faithful and the curses of the damned. To some, he was a savior, to others, a tyrant. But to all, he was a force that changed everything. The empire Paul built didn't crumble when he left, it hardened, solidified by his absence. The myth of Muad'Dib grew larger than the man ever could. His sister Aaliyah carried the weight of his throne, but she couldn't escape his influence. No one could. His vision, his choices, his jihad, these were written into the fabric of the universe. The Fremen never forgot him. To them, he was more than a man. He was the Mahdi, the one who fulfilled their prophecies. But the Fremen themselves changed under his reign. The desert hardened them, but the empire softened them. The warriors who once defied the galaxy found themselves bound by it, and the dream of freedom slipped further away. Paul's greatest legacy wasn't in the empire he forged, but in the lessons he left behind. He was a warning, a reminder of what happens when power grows too great, when vision outstrips humanity. His rise was a tale of hope, but his fall was a caution. The galaxy learned from Paul, but it paid for those lessons in blood. Yet Paul's story didn't end with his walk into the desert. The seeds he planted would grow into the golden path, a future he saw but couldn't bear to create himself. His son, Leto II, would take the burden of that path, shaping humanity in ways even Paul couldn't imagine. But that's another story. Paul Atreides wasn't just a man, he was a mirror. He reflected the ambition, the flaws, and the resilience of humanity. His life was a warning, his legacy was a lesson, and his story, like the sands of Arrakis, would never be forgotten. Paul Atreides was a man who became a legend, but legends are dangerous. They inspire, they unite, and they destroy. Paul didn't set out to change the galaxy, but the galaxy bent to his will all the same. He wanted peace, yet war followed him like a shadow. He sought freedom, but his name became a chain that bound billions. His story is not one of triumph, but of burden. It's a reminder that power comes at a cost, and even the brightest visions can cast the darkest shadows. Paul saw the future, not just his own, but humanity's, and in seeing it, he became trapped by it. His victories were hollow, his losses were staggering, yet his legacy endures. What can we learn from Paul Atreides? Perhaps it's that greatness is never simple. It demands sacrifice, often of the very things we hold dear. Or maybe it's that humanity's strength lies not in its leaders, but in its messiness, its chaos, its refusal to be controlled. Paul tried to shape the galaxy, but in the end, it shaped him. So, what do you think? Was Paul a savior who sacrificed himself for humanity's survival? Or was he a cautionary tale, a man crushed under the weight of his own prophecy? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the life of Muad'Dib, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories from the DUNE universe. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the sands of Arrakis. Until next time, may your path be clear and your destiny your own.